Greetings! I'm glad you've met me here to learn a few things about the TWC content standards for Texas adult education and literacy. We'll be looking at what the standards are and how you can use them. You may not even be aware that we have new standards, and if you are aware of them, you may not realize that the new ones replaced some old ones. It's true, though, that the new 2016 standards replaced the 2008 content standards. The rollout of these standards actually took place in April of 2017. The new 2016 standards focus on employment, career pathways, post-secondary education, and middle-skill jobs. With just a slight inspection, you'll notice that these new standards are a bit more rigorous than the 2008 version. Before this video started, you were encouraged to print off or at least take a look at the content standards for your subject area. Be sure you take notes if you've not printed off a copy so that all of this will make sense when you get your own standards. Perhaps we should take a look at what the standards are. You will see that in a very basic way, the standards are what the students should know and be able to do. The standards have been organized around three very broad content areas: English language arts and literacy, mathematics, and English as a second language. Under the very large and broad umbrella of those content areas in the previous slide, English language arts, math, and ESL, sub-areas were created. Then the sub-areas were broken down into the content standards, and the content standards broken down into very specific components called benchmarks. Let me show you what I mean. The big umbrella that represents the content areas that I've mentioned in the last couple of slides really reflect the big ideas of the represented discipline, ELA, math, or ESL. The content areas are actually the themes that run throughout the curriculum. You will see that the content areas will be represented on your printed copy with Roman numerals: English language arts and literacy, Roman numeral 1, math, Roman numeral 2, and ESL, Roman numeral 3. Under the content areas, you will find the sub-areas. The sub-areas are just a more manageable grouping of information than the broad content areas. You'll see a little more detail than in the broad content areas, even though the sub-areas are still very broad. These sub-areas are represented with a Roman numeral for the content area, plus an Arabic numeral like Roman numeral 1.2. Going down one more level, we reach the content standards. We now get to what the students or learners need to know. These content standards are a very clear outline of the content and skills for developing and aligning the curriculum, the instruction, and the assessments to one another. The content standards and the supporting benchmarks offer a view of what is expected of the students at the exit level. The content standards are represented by a capital letter on your printed copy. Now we're down to where the rubber meets the road, as they say. The benchmarks offer sets of skills for the students and provide detailed information on the specific skills and even context for learners to meet the standards. These benchmarks will lead to the development of measurable performance indicators and assessments. You can even find your behavioral objectives in these benchmarks. The benchmarks are represented by Arabic numerals. Here's a glance at the big picture of the breakdown of the standards. At the top of this slide, you'll see that the content area is English language arts and literacy, represented by a Roman numeral. The sub-areas are Roman numeral 1.1, Reading Foundations, 1.2, Reading, 1.3, Writing, 1.4, Oral and Written Conventions, and 1.5, Research. Here is one of the content standards represented by a capital letter. Beginning reading skills. Phonemic awareness. Understand that the sounds of spoken language work together to make words. Down in the lower right corner, you'll see the benchmark represented by an Arabic numeral. Display awareness of phonics. Letter sound knowledge, segmenting, blending, and manipulating sounds orally and orally. Notice how the different levels go from the very broad content areas to the very specific benchmarks. Keep in mind the breakdown of the standards. The content areas cover a lot of territory and represent the big ideas and not the details. The sub-areas are broken down into more manageable parts and with more details than the content areas. The content standards serve as a clear outline for what the students should know. The benchmarks have all the details and can be used as your objectives. From the benchmarks, you can determine measurable performance indicators and assessments. Now, take just a minute to look at your content standards and benchmarks for your subject area. Be sure you clearly see the broad content areas flow down to the very specific benchmarks. Although we're getting ready to talk about this a little bit more in depth, for now, try to imagine using these tools in your own lesson planning. Hopefully, you were able to actually look at the standards for your own subject area. In order to fully use these standards, we must first talk about unpacking them. Let's see just what that looks like. When unpacking the content standards, you need to look for three things. You'll need to look for the skills, the concepts, and the context. The skills are what the students or learners are expected to do to demonstrate mastery. The concepts are the information that the learners are expected to know. The context consists of the situations where the students apply understanding of concepts and mastery of skills. Why don't we look more closely at these three components? When looking for the skills in the standards or benchmarks, we look for the verb or verb phrases. These skills indicate what the learners are expected to do to demonstrate mastery. The skills also determine the level of thinking required by learners. Take a look at this example of an English language arts and literacy standard. Locate explicit textual information, draw inferences, and analyze and evaluate the information about persuasive texts. You'll see that I've already circled the verbs that you need to pay attention to. These verbs will determine the skills that will be required of the students. Now let's move on to the second thing that we look for in our unpacking process. When we look for the concepts, we usually look for the nouns or the noun phrases in the standard or the benchmark. The concepts comprise the information or the ideas that the learners need to know. You know, those big ideas. Here's the example we looked over earlier. You'll notice that I have now underlined the concepts to show you the information the students need to know. The skills are still circled, and the concepts, or the nouns, are now underlined. The underlined concepts are what the students need to know. As we move on to the third component, to look for in the unpacking process, I must tell you that not all standards or benchmarks have context. Remember that the context constitutes the situation in which the learners are required to use the standard's skills and concepts. Very simply, not all standards will have context as a component. But let's see what context looks like as we examine the next slide. Here is our familiar content standard. You will see the verbs or skills circled, the nouns or content underlined, and you'll see the context written in blue. The context in this standard tells us the situation in which the students will use the skills and the content. For the content standard that we've been working with, we discovered the skills to be locate, draw, analyze, and evaluate. The concepts are information and inferences, and the context is persuasive texts. As you get more familiar with these content standards and sharpen your unpacking skills, you'll discover how your inspiration will unfold. Our next video will help you put these standards and benchmarks into lesson planning action. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.